Hello, and thank you for joining me for Unspun World, the programme where we discuss the big questions with the BBC's unrivalled range of experts. This is the Finnish capital, Helsinki, a city with a particular history caught between Russia and the West. Finland has experienced Russian occupation and invasion, and it's seen plenty of East-West negotiations over the years. So, in this programme, are there any stirrings of peace talks over Ukraine yet?
What is the way of allowing there to be a cessation of hostilities in a way that gives Putin a way out?
What are Russians being told about a war that their media won't even call a war?
For the Russian authorities, the media is a tool that they can use in order to control what people see.
And what effect will the surprising Western solidarity over Ukraine have on China?
Whatever happened now, the West action will serve notice to Beijing.
Russia seems to be getting more and more indiscriminate in its bombings, and it's being accused of using some very nasty weapons indeed, from cluster bombs to thermobaric bombs. There's an urgent need for a peace initiative, but that usually only starts to work when both sides start to realise they can't win. Still, efforts are starting. Ask the BBC's diplomatic correspondent, James Landale, about any early signs of peace talks.
There are some discussions between Ukraine and Russia. We've seen those initial talks. There's not a great sense that these are going to produce any kind of result, simply because talks like that have to happen after some kind of stability has been reached on the battlefield. Either one side has gained on the other, and we're simply not at that stage at the moment.
What might be the sort of shape of a final a disengagement, an agreement? I mean, there will be something at some stage, won't there, even if it's a year or 10 years down the line?
Yes, but as you say, it might take a long time, and there are an awful lot of variables that could happen in the short term that we simply don't know how it's going to pan out. How far does the Russian invasion go? How much territory does it occupy? What happens to the current Ukrainian government? Does it involve death? Or does it involve exile?
What for Zelensky?
For Zelensky and other leaders. You know, we simply don't know what will happen in these circumstances. What happens to the Ukrainian insurgency? On the evidence of the Ukrainian resistance in early days, that would suggest that an insurgency would continue. What does the West do with that insurgency? Does it fuel it with weapons and ammunition? If it does, how does it do that without escalating the situation? Now, insurgencies can last years. I mean, I read some research recently that said on average an insurgency lasts between 8 to 10 years.
Like in Iraq.
Like in Iraq, like in Afghanistan. These things take time, and I think that then we're in a situation of how long is the West prepared to isolate Russia economically? How long is it willing to support that insurgency? And then when, as we say, we get to the end game, what is the way, if there is a way, of potentially allowing there to be a cessation of hostilities, some kind of Russian withdrawal, in a way that gives Putin a way out, but in a way that does not compromise Western principles, does not give away too much of Ukraine's interest.
Has it been a failure of Western diplomacy, or do you think actually with hindsight it was pretty much inevitable that he'd do it?
I think, in my view, it was a failure of diplomacy, but one dating back to the fall of the Soviet Union. The fact that the West failed to go that extra step further to try and accommodate Russia into the new European security architecture. Is it possible that, in past examples of Russian aggression, such as in Moldova, such as in Georgia, such as in Crimea, could the West have been more robust at that point? Because we've reached this stage now where many people feel that Putin thinks that he can do what he wants because the West will huff and puff but won't blow his house down. In the short term, the one thing that I've been really surprised by and have found very striking is the degree of diplomatic activity by the West and the unity within the West.
Particularly Germany, of course.
Particularly Germany.
What a surprise that's been.
Germany has transformed its post-war foreign policy. In a blink of an eye, it is now promising to raise its defence spending. It is promising to allow weapons to go from Germany to Ukraine.
All the things they've refused,
which they've refused to do because of the war guilt and the whole structure that has been built into their political system.
Do you think it can be kind of limited to Ukraine? Or are you worried that it's going to get really bad and we could all start to suffer?
I mean, I worry because the one thing I've learned in the last few days is that the world has changed. I need to change the way I've been thinking for years about how I think, you know, the Western European security order operates, because we're now in a new phase. It's a new world. Russia has done things that we previously thought were pretty unthinkable. So therefore, we should logically think he's prepared to go further. We're in a crisis here. There is escalation and there is miscalculation. You have NATO building up its forces in the east at the moment. There are more NATO jets in the air policing NATO airspace, but NATO airspace is knocking up against Russian airspace. As we know, the potential for error is significant.
Suppose Finland and Sweden joined NATO. How would that change things? Would that stir up Putin even more? Surely it will.
Yes, I think Russia would view that as a hostile act, an aggressive act. They've been very clear about that. Certainly the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman said there would be military and political consequences if that were to happen. So I think NATO might think strategically in the long run it would be good to have these countries in their membership, but at the height of a crisis like this, whether that is the right moment to do that, I think, you know, would give pause to thought.
For years now, President Putin has been squeezing Russia's once lively and opinionated media to the point where independent voices have largely been silenced. So what are most Russians hearing about the war that's being fought in their name? Olga Robinson from the BBC's Russian Monitoring Department is herself half Ukrainian and half Russian.
I think when it comes to Russian disinformation, what you need to understand is that there's a whole industry of media narratives and media outlets that work essentially in unison. State-run, state-operated, or pro-Kremlin, privately owned but still pro-Kremlin in their output. For more than half of the population, television is still the main source of news. And this is the core electorate for Vladimir Putin. Apart from television, you've got pro-Kremlin news websites, news agencies, you've got influencers on social media, media personalities that are incredibly popular. You would have a statement from, let's say, the Russian Defense Ministry talking about atrocities in Ukraine, and then that would be picked up by a range of media outlets, creating this sense of a wide support for the narrative. And it essentially creates almost like a parallel reality. At the moment, Russian state TV is not even mentioning the word invasion or war. What they're talking about is a special military operation. And for the Russian authorities, the media is a tool that they can use in order to control or manage what people see, to a certain extent, what they think. So this is a typical example of what any Russian viewer would see on their screens last weekend. So these are programs that have been given lots of airtime, and they feature all sorts of experts, from Russian MPs to pundits, pro-Kremlin pundits usually, with the occasional token liberal thrown in the mix. So these programs support these narratives. Like, the situation in Ukraine is so bad, we really need to act and act now.
Tell me about the broader type of propaganda coverage that there is.
There's a whole host of daytime talk shows that are incredibly anti-Western and anti-Ukrainian in their nature. They're absolutely full of discussions of international politics. And these programs have been described by some analysts in Russia as politics for housewives. What you're passively consuming is narratives that are in line with what you would normally hear on a current affairs program, but it's presented in a more kind of friendly way. They have now replaced some entertainment program like the Russian equivalent of Dancing with the Stars or Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. These were gone last weekend.
Well, if I may say so, you're, I think, half Russian and half Ukrainian. What do people like your parents? Because there's so many mixed marriages, aren't there, between Ukrainians and Russians. What do you think they think?
I think for many people from mixed marriages and from mixed families, what's happening in Ukraine is just unbelievably tragic. Just simply because, you know, an invasion of a country where half your relatives live it's almost like, you know, bombing your own your neighbors and your friends, your relatives. You know, I mean, it's a very emotional topic because my grandmother still lives in Ukraine. I think in those families, there's a consensus that what is happening is just unbelievable, and it's surreal.
Just a bad dream.
It's a bad dream that people woke up to on Thursday morning, and they just can't wake up.
In the run-up to the invasion of Ukraine and since, Western intelligence has been amazingly accurate in its forecasts of what Russia would do. How did it manage this? I turned to Gordon Carrera, the BBC's security correspondent.
It's astounding how accurate it was and also how public they made it, which is very unusual. How did they get it? There are a couple of possibilities. One is that they've got some agents inside the Russian military or the Kremlin, people who have access to the plans. People, human agents, that would be run by MI6 or the CIA. The other option is, if you like, the electronic signals world. So the West invests a huge amount in the big collection bureaucracies of GCHQ and America's NSA, which suck up signals and intercept communications from Russia. And it's possible either through, say, cyber espionage, hacking into the Russian military's own internal systems, or through intercepting their communications. They've got the plans.
But of course, as you say, the possibility exists that somebody in Putin's entourage is working for the West.
The Russians will fear that there's someone there. And what you're likely to be seeing now is a spy hunt within Moscow. I mean, the FSB, the Russian security service, will be desperately trying to find out, is there a mole at a high level? Is there someone providing the battle plans? Are our communications leaky? How do the West know about it? And if it is a person, they could be at great risk.
Does Western intelligence use kind of psychological profiling and so on? They must do to work out what's in Putin's own mind.
Certainly, particularly in a big organisation like the CIA, they employ these kind of psychologists to read the mind of their adversary, to try and just get any insight into someone like Vladimir Putin, which is quite hard because this is a man who makes decisions himself. He has quite a small circle around him of close advisors. And in the last 2 years, he's not wanted to meet people. He's stayed, you know, in his own bubble. You know, even now, people are sat at the end of desks far away from him when they meet. So trying to get intelligence on him and understand his mindset is actually quite hard.
So all that isolation that he's been through, I mean, that might explain quite a lot about the anger that seems to be welling up in him against Ukraine.
You've definitely got this sense from Putin that the anger at what he sees as Russia's humiliation has been growing. And that's really what he came into power for at the turn of the millennium, was as someone who is going to restore Russia after a decade of humiliation, of being on the back foot economically, politically, militarily, in the terms of the spy wars, the language about Russia being besieged and under attack, you know, the sense in which perhaps he believes some of this, his own rhetoric, it's not just for public display. I think that will be worrying people because it suggests someone whose judgment may not be, you know, as rational as we might think it is. And there is an unpredictability to him.
If he were to decide to use nuclear weapons, I mean, he's reminded us rather heavy-handedly, hasn't he, that he's got them and that they are on the table. How quickly would we know that?
Well, a huge kind of intelligence machine was built up in the Cold War to answer just that question. And so they would study using satellite imagery, using communications intercepts, the behavior of the Russian military, and particularly the bits that looked after nuclear weapons, bombers, submarines as far as they can see them, missile silos. What does normal look like? What does an exercise look like? And then they would look for the abnormal. There's a change in behavior. And those are the kind of signals they'll be looking for now to try and understand, actually, is this just rhetoric? Or are they really moving to a higher state of alert? Or are they even moving potentially to a launch? But there's also a slight sense of instability and fear about, well, what could happen and would we really know? And what is Russian doctrine? Could they use tactical weapons on the battlefield? What would that mean? So I think there is some uncertainty.
Fascinating times.
Fascinating, dark, difficult, not times I think many of us expected, even those who've been, if you like, pessimistic about Russia-West relations, over recent years, after Salisbury, after Skripal, who felt, things are getting worse and they could get worse. Even with that, I think the thought that we'd be where we are now, I think, is a pretty dark surprise.
For some years now, China has been Russia's big supporter on the international stage, though it's been noticeable since the invasion of Ukraine that support is a little bit less warm. Now China's offering to help facilitate peace talks over the whole crisis. I asked Howard Zhang, the head of the BBC's China service, what all this meant.
The whole world is calling it a war, except Russia and China. China is calling it a situation. Occasionally you see a mention of a special operation, but most people, if you check deeper on their social media sharing, more and more people are getting the sense what's going on. About half of the netizens in China in the social media scape are singing whatever the government's telling them, saying this is all US is doing by continue to push for NATO expansion. Now you ask for it. Finally, we got a decisive leader who's going to push back. But at the same time, also, even on the very restricted Chinese social media space, you start to see people challenging this view. Recently, we had 5 professors. This is really rare now in China with all the crackdowns, openly coming out, calling for peace and denouncing the war. And also we have lots of people online praising the bravery of the Ukrainians. And but those posts may not stay too long.
We thought that the China-Russia relationship was so strong that China was actually making it possible for Putin to invade Ukraine. Is that strength of relationship still there, or is it fading?
I think if you just look at the official media, the strength is very much there. But deep down, I think even scholars, pro-government scholars or government scholars, are privately airing a lot more caution and saying, okay, we really have to think of our own interest and to put things into long-term perspective. If we really decide to go down with Putin along this way, this road, in 5-10 years, do we want to face the same scenario as being isolated totally from the world? And from some of the actions from the UN vote, China decided to, instead of supporting Russia, they abstained. And from other signs that apparently Chinese state banks have not really opened up their coffer and extended loans to Russia as many expected yet. But China did lift the ban on importing Russian wheat and energy, of course. China's buying lots of energy. So those things will offer Russia money.
Of course, China has a kind of sort of mirror version of that with Taiwan, doesn't it? I remember seeing something on Weibo, the Chinese equivalent of, I don't know, Twitter or whatever, somebody writing, now would be a good time to go into Taiwan. Do you think that's what the leaders believe?
We did see a lot of what they call the wolf warrior youth, or some of the, the really hot-blooded nationalists online, and even taunting Taiwan, saying, The Ukrainians are demonstrating to you what's going to happen if you keep pushing for it. But now I think even the officials have come out on a couple of occasions saying, please do not link the two. They're not the same issue.
The Taiwanese presumably would resist with something of the ferocity of the Ukrainians, and the West would take the same sort of action against China that they're taking against Russia.
Whatever happened now, the West action will serve notice to Beijing. They will have to recalibrate their future actions on whether to take military action, even though taking military action in the Taiwan Straits is a lot more difficult than Russia taking action in the Ukraine. But Taiwan, you do have a strait. You do have the water there, and Taiwan is armed to the teeth with all the modern defenses. So it's not as simple as the Ukraine operation, of course.
Is it true to say that the Chinese government doesn't like losers, and if it identifies Putin as a loser, they'll move away from him?
Beijing and Moscow see the West as an example of failure. But now, if Putin's adventure in Ukraine turns out to be a major failure, if not, a complete disaster, I think it will eventually make quite a few people think again.
North Korea, under its eccentric leader Kim Jong-un, has also been a supporter of Russia and has duly blamed the United States for forcing Russia to invade Ukraine. But even North Korea's become a bit less strident now. A few days ago it fired what South Korea thought was a ballistic missile into the sea nearby, but North Korea said it was just launching a communications satellite. What is the North Korean approach now? Soo Min Hwang, editor of the BBC Korean service.
We have seen missile launches and tests in the past. However, the timing of this and the frequency of this is very, very unusual. There are various reasons for this. One is to do with the US and Joe Biden's lack of appetite of engaging with North Korea. As we have seen a flurry of excitement a few years ago when Donald Trump was in power, and they even met a few times. However, Joe Biden has called Kim Jong-un a tyrant, and he has imposed his very first sanction in North Korea this January. So what North Korea wants to do is to get attention from the US and create a sense of crisis so that North Korea can resume the talks with the US.
Because things are going really badly.
Things are very bad. COVID has not helped at all. North Korea border has shut down very tightly and strictly in the last 2 years. And because the trade has been shut down, mainly with China, and due to the imposed sanctions, strict sanctions from the international world, the economy has been going down and down and down.
So this is essentially Kim Jong-un jumping up and down, shouting, saying, take notice of me, I want to talk to you, I'm going to make you talk to me. Have I got that right?
In a sense, yes. North Korea is also showing a show of force here. Yes, the economy is really bad. It's also showing to the world, despite those things that's going on locally, we still have these capabilities. And we are seeing various range, long range, short range. They're getting faster. Some of them can evade detection, the radar detection. So it is saying to the world that we are improving and you've got to take notice of us. This also sends a very powerful message to their own people in North Korea. It unifies people against the common enemies, normally the South Korea and US. It also distracts people from their economic difficulties.
What do you think about the relationship between Kim Jong-un and China?
We have been seeing some very interesting, subtle changes in their relationship. China still continues to be their biggest ally economically and politically. And recently we have been seeing signs of North Korea opening up their borders and opening up imports from China. However, in the last few years, there has been some rhetorics and nuances from China condemning North Korea's continued missile launches.
Do you get the feeling that he's walking a tightrope, that everything could start collapsing in North Korea and he would collapse with it, or do you think he's there, like his father, like his grandfather, into the long distant future?
When you see all these missiles being launched from North Korea so frequently, it might seem as if it's a very rogue nation just throwing its toys out of the pram or throwing a tantrum. However, when you really look into their tone, what they say and what they don't say, you can really see a lot of calculations being put behind this. What Kim is doing here is that, yes, they're testing missiles, but actually they're toning back on that really super duper ultra aggressive message to the world.
Soo Min Hwang, editor of the BBC's Korean service. Here in the centre of Helsinki is the idiosyncratic monument to the Winter War of 1939-40, when the Russians invaded Finland full of confidence and got a bloody nose. Sound familiar? The fighting ground on until peace talks came up with a solution. Russia kept some Finnish territory, but Finland maintained its independence. Might there be parallels with Ukraine? It's certainly worth bearing in mind. Thank you for joining me for Unspun